Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped into the shadows that would make him legendary, America itself was standing at a crossroads, a nation swelling with new faces, new ambitions, and new conflicts. At the turn of the 20th century, the country was reshaping itself faster than its institutions could keep up. Waves of immigrants poured into New York's harbor, each carrying hope in their eyes and desperation in their pockets. Those who arrived were promised opportunity, but they found something else waiting in the streets, chaos masquerading as possibility. New York was a city divided, not by ideology but by survival. Neighborhoods became fortresses of ethnicity. Irish dockworkers, Jewish entrepreneurs, Italian laborers, and Eastern European refugees carved out territories block by block, each fighting for the same limited foothold. In these overcrowded tenements and narrow alleys, power wasn't governed by law or morality. It belonged to those willing to seize it. And the government? Corruption rotted it from within. Political machines like Tammany Hall traded favors for votes. Policemen looked the other way for envelopes of cash. Judges bent justice for the right price. America was modernizing on the surface, but beneath that veneer lay a fractured system held together by whispered deals and backdoor threats. It was in this turbulent, unpredictable world that the seeds of American organized crime took root. Before the mafia became mythologized, before its codes, rituals, and hierarchies crystallized, it was nothing more than scattered gangs ruled by emotion, pride, and tradition. Power shifted daily. Street corners were battlefields. Alliances were fragile. Crime existed, yes, but crime as an industry did not. Not yet. Into this volatile environment walked a young Sicilian immigrant named Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano. He did not come from wealth, nobility, or influence. He came from hunger, the kind of hunger that sharpened the mind long before it hardened the heart. But unlike the countless boys growing up in the same slums, Luciano saw something others missed. America wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place where power could be redesigned. While rival gangs obsessed over territory and petty extortion, Luciano saw a bigger picture emerging. One shaped not by bloodlines or brawls but by organization. He understood instinctively that the future of power in America wouldn't belong to the strongest fists, but to the strongest systems. It is here, in this moment of national instability and urban transformation, that the foundation of Luciano's legend begins to form. Not on a battlefield. Not in a dramatic shootout. But in the quiet spaces between chaos, where a boy observed the patterns others ignored. He noticed how money moved through neighborhoods. How corrupt politicians needed muscle to enforce their will. How frightened shopkeepers needed protection as much from authorities as from criminals. How immigrants trusted men who understood their languages and their struggles. These were the cracks in the American structure. Small, invisible openings through which a visionary could build something unprecedented. Luciano's genius was not brute force. It was recognizing opportunity where others saw only disorder. And yet, his story is more than the rise of a gangster. It is the story of how power itself evolved in America. For generations, criminals acted like warlords, each one fighting for dominance over tiny empires that collapsed with every arrest or assassination. Luciano asked a different question. Why fight over scraps when you can build a system that feeds everyone and controls everything? This was the question that would ultimately reshape the American underworld from the inside out. It haunted him, guided him, and pushed him to challenge traditions that had ruled Sicilian crime for centuries. It drove him to form alliances across ethnic lines, to replace rivalry with structure, and to imagine a criminal order that could function like a corporation. Luciano would one day introduce concepts such as the commission, profit sharing, conflict mediation, and nationwide coordination. Ideas unheard of in the violent, ego-driven world he inherited. But those achievements belong to later chapters. Here at the beginning, the focus is on the soil in which such a mind could grow, an America full of corruption and promise, disorder and opportunity, fear and ambition. A country being reborn. An underworld waiting to be defined. And in the shadows of immigrant streets, a quiet architect watching, learning, preparing. The question that echoes through history is simple yet profound. How did one man, armed not with armies but with insight, quietly redesign the very structure of crime in the United States? This book is the answer to that question. Before Lucky Luciano ever took his first calculated breath in the American underworld, the criminal landscape of early 20th century America was already cracking under the weight of change. The country was swelling with industrial ambition. Factories roaring, railroads stretching across states, skyscrapers climbing skyward. Yet beneath this booming exterior lay a world held together not by laws or institutions, but by survival, instinct, and desperation. America was modernizing. Its criminals were not. The early mafia, if it could even be called that, existed as a scattered constellation of neighborhood gangs, each clinging to its own traditions, grudges, and territorial scraps. Sicilians fought Sicilians, Calabrians distrusted Neapolitans, and every ethnic enclave believed itself superior to the next. What should have been a unified force instead resembled a family shattered into 1,000 pieces. Power changed hands not through strategy but through bloodshed. Leadership didn't come from vision, it came from whoever survived the longest. Ethnic rivalries, a city carved into tribes. New York, the epicenter of America's underworld, was divided like a patchwork quilt stitched from tension. Italian gangs fought Irish mobs for control of the docks. Jewish crews clashed with Italian extortionists over gambling turf. Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods forged their own networks of resistance and influence. In these streets, accents mattered, birthplace determined alliances, and violence was the most common language. A single insult could spark a war. A contested corner could leave bodies piled by sunrise. There was no central authority. No rules everyone respected. No structure binding these tribes into anything resembling cohesion. The mafia wasn't an organization. It was a scattered instinct. The old mafia, bound by tradition, broken by reality. Many early Italian gang leaders clung stubbornly to the codes of the old world. Omerta, blood vengeance, rigid hierarchies, tribal loyalty. These traditions had meaning in Sicilian villages, where families lived for generations under the same roofs, where disputes could be traced across decades of history. But America was different. Here, the streets didn't respect tradition. Opportunity didn't pause for rituals. And violence didn't follow rules. The old world bosses tried to transplant a medieval code into a modern city, and the result was dysfunction. Their insistence on Sicilian purity isolated them from the emerging power players of other ethnicities. Their obsession with rank slowed them in moments that demanded speed. Their refusal to adapt blinded them to the shifting currents of an industrializing nation. They were kings of sand, powerful only until the next wave. Loose networks, crime without structure. Before Luciano's rise, criminal networks operated more like survival groups than organizations. Crews formed around charismatic thugs or local strongmen who controlled territory through intimidation rather than management. Their earnings were unpredictable, their alliances volatile, their futures uncertain. Gambling dens opened and closed overnight. Bootlegging routes shifted constantly. Protection rackets depended on who was alive that week. There were no standardized operations, no oversight, no long-term planning. Crime was a patchwork of disconnected hustles, profitable in the moment, unstable in the long run. No empire could grow from such disorder. But opportunity could. Because in chaos, the man who sees clearly becomes king. Violence without vision, a system doomed to collapse. The underworld of early 1900s America bled without strategy. Assassinations were frequent, often senseless. Young gangsters killed for status rather than power. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds due to misunderstandings or impulsive retaliation. This wasn't organized crime. This was chaotic crime. Every killing invited police pressure. Every feud weakened the network. Every stolen dollar carried $10 worth of risk. The mafia had the manpower to dominate cities but not the mindset. Without structure, they were destined to tear themselves apart. America's transformation, a nation outpacing its criminals while the mafia clung to the past, America charged into the future. Factories needed labor. Ports needed organization. Cities needed infrastructure. Money flowed through industries that criminals barely understood. If someone could bridge old-world loyalty with new-world opportunity, the entire criminal landscape could evolve. Then came Prohibition, the national ignition of the underworld. For the first time, criminals encountered a business so big it demanded coordination. Bootlegging wasn't a street hustle, it was a supply chain. It required transportation, bribery, distribution, accounting, and protection. The old mafia had none of these tools. They had men who could kill. They needed men who could organize. The times called for a leader who could think like a businessman, negotiate like a diplomat, manipulate like a politician, and, when necessary, strike like a gangster. Someone who understood that power wasn't in territory, it was in networks. Not in tradition, but in innovation. A backdrop perfectly suited for a visionary in this fractured, volatile, opportunity-rich environment, America unwittingly prepared the stage for Lucky Luciano. He would emerge not as another street boss, but as a designer, a strategist whose mind was years ahead of his rivals. He saw cooperation where others saw rivalry, profit where others saw pride, structure where others saw chaos. The underworld was broken, but breakage creates openings for those who know how to rebuild. Early 20th century America didn't just allow Luciano's rise, it required it. Without a mind capable of bringing order to this chaos, the mafia would have destroyed itself before it ever became a national force. But one young immigrant, watching from the edges, learning from the cracks, understood that an empire wasn't something you seized. It was something you designed. And from this chaotic nation of tribes, violence and opportunity, the architect of modern organized crime was about to step forward. Before the world knew him as Lucky Luciano, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a small Sicilian boy navigating the chaos of New York's Lower East Side, a place where hope and hunger collided on every street corner. Born into poverty, shaped by danger and sharpened by necessity, young Salvatore arrived in America not with dreams, but with questions. How does power work? Who truly controls a neighborhood? And why do some men rise while others disappear into anonymity? These questions would guide him long before he had the language to articulate them. The Lower East Side, a city within a city at the dawn of the 20th century, the Lower East Side was a cauldron of noise, sweat, and ambition. Buildings sagged under the weight of overcrowded families. Children ran barefoot through alleys that smelled of coal dust and desperation. Vendors shouted in half a dozen languages. Fights erupted as quickly as friendships. Survival wasn't a virtue, it was a requirement. The Lucania family lived in one cramped room, where winters froze their fingertips and summers suffocated their lungs. Salvatore shared his bed with siblings and his dreams with no one. There was no privacy, no comfort. Only the constant reminder that America was not the land of promise they had imagined. But the streets? The streets were alive, brutal, unpredictable, and full of possibility. Early encounters with violence. Lessons before language violence came early. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't mythic. It was casual. Ordinary. A part of the landscape. Salvatore watched older boys beat a shopkeeper who refused to pay insurance. He saw immigrants robbed before they could reach their tenements. He heard the stories whispered by exhausted laborers, stories of bosses, bullies, enforcers, and quiet deals made behind butcher shops and bakeries. The Lower East Side taught him something invaluable. Violence wasn't chaos, it was currency. Power wasn't loud, it was negotiated. Most kids feared this world. Salvatore studied it. He learned when to speak and when to disappear. When to fight and when to let someone else swing for him. How to read an adult's intentions by the twitch of an eyebrow. These weren't the lessons of a gangster. They were the lessons of a strategist. The immigrant struggle, a furnace that forged ambition. Being an Italian immigrant meant being at the bottom. Italians were mocked, underpaid, and distrusted by employers and authorities alike. Children like Salvatore were treated as though their futures were predetermined. Factory work, manual labor, maybe a small shop if luck allowed. But Salvatore refused to see life in those small, suffocating terms. Every hardship felt like a message. This world will not make space for you, you must carve it yourself. His father worked tirelessly but never gained ground. His mother stretched meager meals into illusions of plenty. Their exhaustion carved something deep into Salvatore's young mind. He would never depend on a system designed to keep him low. He would find a system of his own, or build one. That seed, planted in the soil of poverty, would one day grow into one of the most sophisticated criminal frameworks in American history. The awakening. Understanding people as maps. While most boys learned through schoolbooks, Salvatore learned through observation. He studied the way men argued, the way women bargained for better prices, the way gang leaders commanded loyalty without ever raising their voices. He began to understand people as if they were maps. Some had weak points you could push. Some had fears you could soothe. Some had ambitions you could use. And some had no vision at all, which made them predictable. Even as a child, he possessed an uncanny ability to read intentions before they were spoken. This wasn't charm. It wasn't manipulation. It was accuracy. A psychological sharpness that allowed him to maneuver through conflict without relying on violence. While other boys fought to survive, Salvatore negotiated to win. Crossing ethnic lines, the first sign of a new mind in a neighborhood carved into tribes, Jewish boys sticking with Jewish boys, Italians with Italians, Irish with Irish. Salvatore did something unusual. He crossed boundaries. He befriended Jewish street kids. Learned Yiddish slang. Watched Irish boys hustle for jobs by the docks. He saw value where others saw differences. This ability would become his signature strength as an adult. The most defining friendship of his youth, with Meyer Lansky, began when Salvatore confronted him in a moment that could have turned violent. Lansky's refusal to be intimidated impressed him, and instead of a rivalry, a partnership was born. Salvatore didn't yet know the full meaning of their connection. But he sensed this truth: power grows when you build bridges others are too afraid to cross. Small-time hustles, the training ground by adolescence. Salvatore was already drifting into petty rackets, running errands for older gangsters, guiding gamblers to backroom dens, acting as lookout during small-scale shakedowns. But unlike others his age, he wasn't intoxicated by the thrill. He was fascinated by the structure. Who paid who? Who reported to who? How did money flow? What happened when one link failed? He wasn't participating in crime. He was studying the underworld's architecture, searching for invisible rules that even the criminals didn't realize they were following. This was his first true psychological awakening. Crime was not random, it was a system waiting to be organized. A vision larger than the streets. While his peers dreamed of making quick dollars or earning a gang nickname, Salvatore dreamed of commanding complexity. He wanted networks, not corners. Systems, not scraps. Influence, not noise. He didn't know how yet. But he saw the possibility, faint but undeniable. He recognized that the mafia of his time was inefficient, short-sighted, and ruled by men who mistook brutality for strategy. Even as a teenager, he sensed that the old ways were dying and a new kind of leader would soon be necessary. Someone who understood people. Someone who understood opportunity. Someone who understood America. A street kid with a bigger vision than anyone imagined. That kid was Lucky Luciano. And the world he would build was already forming in his mind. Blueprint by blueprint, lesson by lesson, instinct by instinct, long before he ever entered the halls of power. Before Lucky Luciano became the architect of modern organized crime, he was a teenager standing at the crossroads of New York's underworld, part observer, part participant, and part visionary. He had grown beyond petty street hustles, yet the world he wanted to reshape was still dominated by men who mistook tradition for strength and brutality for leadership. Luciano understood that if he stayed confined to the small rackets of the Lower East Side, he would rot there like everyone else. He wasn't meant to be a thug. He was meant to be a designer of power. And the streets, violent, shifting, unpredictable, were about to give him the first tools he needed. From hustles to strategy, the awakening of ambition. Luciano's early hustles, running errands for bookmakers, guiding gamblers to underground dens, collecting debts, paid little, but they offered something far more valuable: exposure. He saw how money traveled, how deals were struck in whispers, how loyalty shifted with the wind, how every small racket fed into bigger ones. While other young gangsters chased quick cash, Luciano chased patterns. He understood instinctively that climbing the ladder wasn't about muscle, it was about knowing who pulled the strings behind the curtain. He learned the simple truth that shaped his rise: if you understand the system better than the man above you, you will eventually replace him. First steps into real power, the bigger games. By his late teens, Luciano was no longer content with errands. He moved into more sophisticated operations. Gambling dens where he absorbed how odds, payouts, and flow of money created stability. Protection rackets where he learned the psychology of fear and reassurance. Street-level narcotics, which taught him discretion and the danger of greed. He wasn't the strongest fighter, but he was the smartest negotiator. Rival crews noticed. Older bosses noticed. Luciano had a rare skill. He could calm tensions before they exploded, turn enemies into temporary allies, and make deals that benefited both sides. His reputation grew not through violence but through usefulness. But the streets alone couldn't take him where he needed to go. He needed partners who matched his ambition. He needed minds as sharp as his own. He found them in two unlikely friends, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Enter Meyer Lansky, the strategist. Luciano first encountered Meyer Lansky on a street corner, a thin, sharp-eyed Jewish kid who refused to be intimidated when Luciano's crew attempted to shake down his group. That spark of defiance caught Luciano off guard, and instead of escalating, he studied Lansky. Here was a boy who thought before he acted, a rarity in their world. Over the next months, Luciano and Lansky formed a quiet alliance built not on ethnicity or tradition, but on recognition. Each saw in the other a mind capable of more than small-time hustles. Lansky possessed mathematical brilliance and an ability to structure gambling operations with scientific precision. Luciano saw the value instantly. They complemented each other. Luciano read people. Lansky read numbers. Both read opportunity. Together they began building something different from the ethnic gangs around them. A partnership based on intellect, ambition, and long-term thinking. Bugsy Siegel, The wild card with purpose where Lansky was disciplined, Bugsy Siegel was electric, fearless, unpredictable, charming, and lethal when needed. Lansky trusted him. Luciano understood him. Siegel was the type of man who could walk into a room and dominate it with presence alone. Luciano didn't admire Siegel for his violence. He admired him for his effectiveness. Siegel could intimidate without losing control, make allies without losing respect, and execute volatile tasks without hesitation. Together, the trio formed the core of a new model: brains plus diplomacy plus controlled force. This combination was unprecedented in a criminal landscape where leadership usually meant being the loudest or most violent. Luciano had found something more potent than muscle: balance. A vision that challenged old-world thinking. The Italian mafia of the time was deeply rooted in Sicilian tradition. Bloodline mattered more than talent. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. Collaboration with outsiders, especially Jews or Irish, was unthinkable. Luciano didn't care. He saw the limitation of tribal thinking. He saw how rigidity prevented growth. He saw opportunity in diversity long before the underworld understood it. With Lansky and Siegel, he built something radical: a multi-ethnic alliance. They shared rackets, intelligence, and strategy. They pooled resources and protected each other. They broke the unwritten racial barriers of crime and created an ecosystem where the best ideas, not the purest blood, shaped success. This alliance wasn't just friendship. It was the foundation of a new criminal order. Making moves, deals that defined the future. Luciano's ascent accelerated when he inserted himself into higher-level rackets. He helped streamline bootlegging routes during Prohibition. He negotiated truces between warring factions when older bosses failed. He diversified investments: gambling, narcotics, nightlife, spreading risk strategically. His genius lay in his ability to scale operations. Where others saw a street corner, he saw a supply chain. Where others saw a rival, he saw a potential partner. Where others saw tradition, he saw dead weight. His alliances with Lansky and Siegel allowed him to operate beyond the Italian underworld, giving him access to financial acumen, strategic innovation, and enforcement muscle unmatched by any single ethnic group. Together they were not building a gang. They were building a network. Replacing the old guard, the quiet rise of a modern Don. By his early 20s, Luciano had surpassed most men twice his age in influence. The old-world bosses still controlled the hierarchy, but they couldn't control the future. Their rigidity was showing cracks, and their inability to adapt created space for Luciano's emerging model. He wasn't trying to overthrow them. He was simply outgrowing them. Older mafiosi dismissed him as disrespectful. Younger gangsters adored him. Politicians and hustlers found him reliable. Rivals found him unsettlingly calm. The truth was simple: Luciano didn't want power, he wanted order. And power followed naturally. His rise wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't accidental. It was engineered, piece by piece, alliance by alliance, insight by insight. From the slums of the Lower East Side to the smoky backrooms of speakeasies, Luciano climbed the ladder not because he was the strongest, but because he understood something no one else did. Crime wasn't about chaos. It was about structure. And he would be the one to build it. For generations, the Sicilian underworld had lived and died by a single principle: omerta, the code of absolute silence. Silence toward the law. Silence toward outsiders. Silence even toward one's own doubts. In Sicily, omerta was not merely a rule, it was a moral universe. It defined manhood, loyalty, and honor. But the America that Lucky Luciano grew up in was a different creature entirely: louder, faster, more complex than the rural villages where the code had been born. And as Luciano rose through the ranks of New York's chaotic criminal world, he realized something the old bosses refused to see. Omerta in its pure form no longer worked. Not in America. Not in a world built on networks rather than bloodlines. What the mafia needed was not silence for silence's sake, but silence with purpose. Silence as strategy. And so, Luciano began to reinterpret the code that had once been sacred. Omerta as weight, the burden of tradition. To most Sicilian bosses, omerta meant unwavering obedience. It meant keeping your head down, never questioning authority, never challenging the rituals that had governed their ancestors for centuries. But Luciano, even in his youth, felt the psychological weight of that rigidity. Omerta demanded that men accept orders even when those orders led to disaster. Omerta demanded that men die for pride rather than adapt for survival. Omerta demanded that tradition matter more than results. Luciano saw the flaw immediately. Absolute silence might protect individuals, but it paralyzed organizations. The mafia in America wasn't a unified society, it was a collection of feuding tribes. Blind obedience only intensified fractures, creating bosses who ruled through ego and emotion rather than intelligence. In this world, omerta wasn't a code. It was a cage. And cages are meant to be broken. A young mind challenging the old world, Luciano didn't reject omerta outright. That would have been suicide. Instead, he studied it. He analyzed what made it powerful, what made it outdated, and where it could be repurposed. He realized omerta had two components: silence as loyalty, silence as protection. But there was a third potential meaning, one the old guard never considered: silence as leverage. To Luciano, secrecy wasn't about fear, it was about control. If you withheld information, you controlled outcomes. If you understood others better than they understood you, you shaped their behavior. If you confined your thoughts behind calm eyes, you became unpredictable. The old bosses used omerta as a wall. Luciano used it as a mirror, creating reflections that revealed more than they concealed. Loyalty reimagined. From sacred oath to strategic pact, traditionalists believed loyalty was supposed to be blind, inherited, unquestionable. But Luciano saw loyalty differently. Loyalty had to be earned, maintained, reciprocal, and grounded in results. You didn't follow a man because of where he was born, you followed him because he made everyone richer, safer, and stronger. Loyalty wasn't a sacred oath, it was a calculated pact. This shift was revolutionary. Under Luciano's emerging philosophy, loyalty became a business arrangement. You stay loyal because it benefits you. I stay loyal because it benefits me. The system stays stable because we all gain from stability. This was omerta reinterpreted for a modern world, not a moral contract but a structural one. Communication, the new foundation of power. Ironically, the code of silence forced Luciano to value communication even more. He saw firsthand how misunderstandings led to unnecessary killings, how rumors sparked wars, and how secrecy itself could become a weapon for manipulation. So while he refined the silence of omerta, he also built new channels for clarity within his inner circle. Concise information sharing, trusted intermediaries, coded messaging, rule-based negotiations, private councils for decision-making. He didn't abolish secrecy. He organized it. Old mafia leaders hoarded information to feel powerful. Luciano shared information strategically to make the system powerful. Profit over pride, a new moral compass to the old bosses. Honor was everything. A perceived insult could ignite a war that burned entire neighborhoods. Luciano saw this as madness, a waste of resources, a disruption of profit, an erosion of stability. He replaced the code of pride with the code of profit. Under his philosophy, wars were last resorts, killing required purpose, violence had to produce outcomes, emotional decisions were liabilities, organization mattered more than ego. The shift was so radical that older mafiosi viewed him as dangerous, not because he was violent but because he was changing the rules they lived by. Omerta as strategy, silence reborn. Luciano's ultimate reinterpretation of omerta was elegant. Silence is not obedience. Silence is power. He remained quiet in meetings, letting others expose their insecurities. He spoke minimally, preserving ambiguity. He used pauses as psychological pressure. He allowed rivals to underestimate him, mistaking calmness for submission. This was the silence of a chess player, not a servant. Luciano turned omerta into a tactical tool, a way to gather information, project strength, and disarm enemies without lifting a weapon. The philosophy that would redesign the mafia. Luciano's reinterpretation of omerta wasn't just a personal belief. It became the philosophical backbone of the modern mafia. It allowed multi-ethnic alliances, structured leadership councils, standardized operations, smooth communication, less internal conflict. He took an old world code and transformed it into an engine of organizational stability. The old mafia swore loyalty to tradition. Luciano swore loyalty to results. And in doing so, he redefined not only the meaning of omerta, but the meaning of power itself. He showed that leadership didn't come from fear, it came from intelligence. That control didn't come from shouting, it came from silence. And that empires weren't built on blood oaths, they were built on design. When Lucky Luciano looked at the American underworld of the 1920s, he didn't see a network of gangs. He saw a broken company, a chaotic assortment of independent operators fighting over scraps, duplicating labor, wasting resources, and killing profit with every petty feud. To him, the mafia wasn't an empire waiting to rise. It was a corporation waiting to be built. Where most gangsters craved money or fear, Luciano craved efficiency. He wanted a system that functioned smoothly, predictably, and profitably. And he was willing to break centuries of tradition to make it happen. This was the blueprint that turned scattered hustles into an American institution. Seeing crime as industry, the vision that changed everything. Prohibition had created an opportunity larger than anything the underworld had ever seen. Illegal alcohol wasn't a street hustle, it was a national supply chain. It required planning, logistics, storage, transportation, and distribution. But old world bosses approached it like they approached everything else, with emotion, pride, and improvisation. Luciano approached it like a CEO. He asked questions no one else was asking. Why compete when cooperation doubles profit? Why kill rivals when partnerships create stability? Why run a single racket when diversification protects the empire? Why leave decisions to one man's temper when committees ensure longevity? The mafia didn't need a king. It needed a model. So Luciano built one. Bootlegging, creating a national pipeline. Bootlegging became Luciano's testing ground, the proving space where he refined corporate thinking inside a criminal context. Instead of treating illegal alcohol as a local hustle, he organized it as a national supply network. He divided operations into departments. 1. Procurement, sourcing high-quality liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, and Midwest distilleries. 2. Transportation, fleets of trucks with rotating drivers and alternative routes to avoid predictable patterns. 3. Storage, warehouses disguised as legitimate businesses. 4. Distribution, reliable deliveries to speakeasies, nightclubs, and political patrons. 5. Security, crews led by Bugsy Siegel to ensure compliance and safety. Where other gangs experienced shortages, betrayals, or police crackdowns, Luciano's network ran like a machine. He had turned crime into commerce. Gambling, a predictable cash engine. Gambling, unlike bootlegging, was constant. It didn't depend on legislation or supply chains. What it needed was fairness, safety, and organization, all of which Luciano understood instinctively. He standardized betting odds, payout schedules, rules for operators, territories for bookies, monthly dues for protection. He eliminated rogue operators who cheated customers or attracted unnecessary heat. He centralized profits by ensuring every gambling den kicked up a fixed percentage to the leadership. And for the first time, gambling produced reliable revenue, not chaotic bursts of cash. Prostitution, transforming a disordered racket. Before Luciano, prostitution rings in New York were unpredictable and violent, controlled by pimps who operated independently and often irrationally. Luciano saw inefficiency everywhere, exploitation that caused instability, operations that collapsed when one individual was arrested, and brutality that attracted too much attention. So he implemented a system. Organized brothels managed by women rather than pimps, reducing emotional volatility. Set pricing models to maintain consistency and prevent turf wars. Medical protocols to protect profits by ensuring workers stayed healthy. Rotational schedules to avoid burnout and police suspicion. Centralized accounting to track profits without exposing leadership. He treated prostitution like a service industry, eliminating unnecessary violence and replacing it with structure. This alone generated millions, and gave Dewey ammunition years later. Labor unions, the mafia's corporate expansion. If bootlegging made Luciano rich, the unions made him powerful. He recognized early that labor unions controlled everything. Ports, construction, trucking, manufacturing, food distribution, any industry dependent on human labor could be influenced through unions. Where older mobsters demanded protection money from individual businesses, Luciano infiltrated entire sectors. He placed trusted lieutenants inside leadership roles or as consultants, giving him indirect control over which companies received contracts, which deliveries moved on time, which strikes ended or escalated, which politicians gained labor support. The unions became Luciano's corporate arm, a legitimate seeming channel through which the mafia wielded economic leverage far greater than violence alone could achieve. This was not extortion. It was industrial influence. Delegation, the secret to sustainability. Luciano knew no single man could control a growing empire. So he delegated, not out of weakness but out of design. His organizational pyramid became a model for decades. Top tier, the strategists, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, and a select few who shaped long-term planning. Middle tier, the executives, capos who managed daily operations of territories and rackets, making decisions without waiting for permission. Lower tier, the workforce, soldiers, runners, drivers, collectors, the operational backbone of the empire. This structure ensured two things: continuity, the system worked even if one part was removed; scalability, operations could expand without creating instability. Luciano had built a corporation disguised as a criminal syndicate. Eliminating inefficiencies, Wars were bad business to Luciano. War was waste. It cost money. It disrupted business. It attracted police attention. It endangered stability. He promoted negotiation over bloodshed, profit over pride. When disputes arose, he mediated instead of escalating. When rivals emerged, he offered partnerships instead of bullets. This philosophy would later lead him to create the Commission, the Mafia's governing council. But the roots of that innovation were planted in these early years. Luciano believed that violence should be strategic, not emotional. It should solve problems, not create them. This alone separated him from the old-world bosses whose pride repeatedly burned down their empires. A sustainable empire, the first of its kind by the mid-1920s, Luciano had turned crime into an industry. He hadn't yet reached the height of his power, but the blueprint was complete. Diversified revenue streams, clear hierarchy, strong alliances, efficient operations, reduced internal conflict, high profitability. He had built something rare in the criminal world, a sustainable business model. His empire didn't depend on brutality. It depended on structure. It didn't survive because of fear. It survived because of design. Luciano didn't simply build the American Mafia. He modernized it, industrialized it, reinvented it. And in doing so, he created a machine that would run long after he was gone, the invisible corporate engine driving America's underworld for decades. Power never rises alone. It grows through alliances, fractures through rivalries, and survives only as long as the man who controls it understands the relationships surrounding him. As Lucky Luciano ascended the ranks of New York's underworld, the people around him became the true measure of his strength, and the greatest threat to it. His world was a moving chessboard. Friends were pieces he elevated with purpose, enemies were pieces he removed with precision, and every decision had consequences that could end his life in a heartbeat. In that shadowed world, loyalty was currency, betrayal was inevitable, and power was only ever borrowed. The allies, minds and monsters who helped shape a king before he became the central architect of the American Mafia, Luciano surrounded himself with a select few who did more than assist him. They defined him. Meyer Lansky, the quiet genius behind the curtain. If Luciano was the architect, Lansky was the engineer. Their friendship, forged in youth, matured into one of the most important partnerships in the history of organized crime. Lansky possessed something rare: discipline without ego. He analyzed risk with mathematical precision and understood money with a clarity that bordered on instinct. Where Luciano saw the big picture, Lansky built the blueprint. Where others fought emotionally, Lansky strategized logically. He reinforced one of Luciano's deepest beliefs: power is safest when shared among those who think, not those who shout. Vito Genovese, the ambitious shadow at his side. If Lansky was Luciano's stabilizer, Genovese was his warning. Charismatic, brutal, and ravenously ambitious, Vito Genovese was both ally and threat. His loyalty came with teeth. He admired Luciano's leadership but envied his influence. Luciano kept him close for two reasons. Genovese was effective. Dangerous men are best policed from proximity. Luciano understood him the way a chess player understands the piece that can win the game or betray it. Genovese represented a truth Luciano never forgot. Every ally contains the seed of an enemy. Bugsy Siegel, the blade of their alliance. Siegel was the necessary force behind Luciano's early climb, a man who could charm one room and terrify the next. He loved risk, thrived on adrenaline, and carried out dangerous assignments with fearless efficiency. If Lansky built stability, Siegel created movement. His violence wasn't aimless, it was purposeful, directed, and loyal. Luciano trusted him with the jobs that required ruthlessness. He also trusted him enough to know what Siegel could never be: a strategist. Siegel was a weapon, not a kingmaker. The enemies, men blind to the future, Luciano could see, but Luciano's rise wasn't shaped only by those who supported him. It was molded equally by the men who tried to stop him. Joe, the boss, Masuria, the tyrant of tradition. When Luciano entered the upper ranks of the Mafia, Masuria ruled with the mindset of a medieval warlord. His power rested on fear, superstition, and brute force. He demanded loyalty without offering vision, tribute without offering structure, obedience without offering growth. To Luciano, Masuria represented everything wrong with the old Mafia: pride over profit, violence over negotiation, tradition over innovation. Luciano served him only long enough to understand him, and long enough to find a way around him. The psychological chess began the moment Luciano recognized a simple truth: Masuria's world was ending. Luciano's was beginning. Salvatore Maranzano, the Roman strategist with a fatal flaw. After Masuria, Luciano faced an enemy far more dangerous: Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian don who fancied himself the Julius Caesar of the American underworld. Intelligent, calculating, and methodical, Maranzano introduced structure and hierarchy, things that initially appealed to Luciano. But Maranzano's flaw was his desire for absolute rule. He wanted to be the capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. Luciano realized immediately that Maranzano wasn't a reformer. He was a conqueror dressed as an administrator. Luciano respected Maranzano's discipline but rejected his obsession with power. In Maranzano he saw the final obstacle to the system he envisioned. A system where power was distributed, regulated, and stabilized, not hoarded at the top. Their alliance was temporary. Their clash was inevitable. The chess game, loyalty and betrayal with high stakes. Luciano's greatest skill was not violence. It was navigation. He understood the psychology of the men around him. Masuria ruled by fear. Maranzano ruled by hierarchy. Genovese ruled by desire. Lansky ruled by reason. Siegel ruled by presence. Luciano ruled by design. He used loyalty as leverage, not religion. He used betrayal as strategy, not impulse. He used alliances as architecture, not convenience. The quiet balance of power to survive. Luciano mastered 3 principles. 1. Know what every man wants. Ambition reveals weaknesses faster than fear. 2. Give loyalty where it is useful. Not to please men but to position yourself for the future. 3. Betray only when the alternative is destruction. Never out of anger, only out of necessity. These rules shaped his climb. They also protected him from the constant threat of assassination, the trapdoors built by rivals, and the shifting alliances that defined the underworld. Each time Luciano betrayed someone he replaced them with a system, not a person. This was his psychological advantage. Fragility, what Luciano understood better than all of them. Power, he learned, is never solid. It is a bridge suspended over shifting loyalties and hidden resentments. It lasts only as long as the man holding it understands how to manage the people beneath him. What made Luciano unique wasn't that he survived the violence. It was that he understood the mathematics of trust, how much to give, how much to demand, and when to sever ties before they became nooses. His alliances with Lansky, Siegel, and even Genovese weren't accidents. His dismantling of Masuria and Maranzano wasn't impulsive. Every step upward was measured, calculated, and designed. Luciano wasn't just climbing the ladder, he was rebuilding it while climbing. The making of a don. By the end of this stage in his rise, Luciano understood something profound. Power survives not because a man is feared, but because he is essential. And Luciano had made himself essential, to allies who needed his vision, to enemies who underestimated him, to an underworld desperate for structure. He wasn't a don yet. But the blueprint was complete. The next battles would not be fought with fists or bullets, but with strategy, betrayal, and the quiet art of reshaping the American mafia from the inside. Before the American mafia became a coordinated empire, it was a battlefield of clashing traditions, competing bosses, and rival visions of power. Nowhere was this chaos more explosive than in the Castellammarese War, a 2-year conflict, 1930 to 1931, that consumed the underworld, shattered alliances, and threatened to destroy the mafia before it ever truly formed. It was a war between the past and the future. Between Sicilian rigidity and American ambition. Between those who wanted kings, and the man who wanted a system. In the middle of this bloody storm stood Lucky Luciano, a young but rising strategist who understood something no one else did. This war wasn't about survival, it was an opportunity to redesign the entire structure of power. 2 titans, 1 battleground, the rise of conflict for decades. Joe, the boss Masuria dominated New York's Italian underworld with brute force and unwavering ego. His rule depended on fear, protection, money, and tribal loyalty. He believed in hierarchy, tradition, and unquestioned obedience. Across the city, a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano, a Castellammarese Sicilian mafioso with military discipline and a Roman obsession for hierarchy, challenged Masuria's fading dominance. Maranzano commanded respect through structure and calculation, but behind the discipline was the same ambition, absolute power. The lines were drawn. Masuria, the old guard of Americanized Sicilians, crude but entrenched. Maranzano, the traditional Sicilian faction, organized and determined. Their feud ignited the deadliest mafia conflict New York had ever seen. Violence as language, streets drenched in blood. The war was not fought in open fields but in alleys, restaurants, stairwells, and parked cars. Soldiers from both sides vanished overnight, their bodies discovered in gutters or never found at all. Businesses shut down out of fear. Rival crews launched hit after hit, and each assassination invited retaliation. Newspapers reported the violence with morbid fascination. Dead men in taxis, bombings in quiet neighborhoods, shootouts that erupted in broad daylight. The city felt like a powder keg. The mafia felt like it was eating itself alive. And in the middle of this carnage, Luciano watched quietly, calculating, adapting, and preparing. Luciano's dilemma? Loyalty versus vision. Luciano was officially aligned with Masuria, but his loyalty was thin. He admired Maranzano's discipline and organizational mind, yet he saw both men's fatal flaw. Neither understood America. They were fighting a Sicilian war on American streets. Luciano believed the future mafia needed cooperation, not feud structure, not monarchy profit, not pride alliances beyond ethnicity, leadership through logic, not paranoia. Both Masuria and Maranzano were relics from another era, men unable to adapt to the new criminal landscape that prohibition had created. So Luciano made his choice. He would survive the war by ending it. And he would end it by removing both kings. The assassination attempt, a warning from the past. Luciano's strategic neutrality didn't go unnoticed. One night he was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and dumped at a beach in Staten Island, left for dead. The message was clear: choose a side or die. He survived. Barely. But the attack only strengthened his resolve. He understood that the war wasn't going to stop until someone ended it, permanently. And if he didn't act soon, he'd be another body on the street. Playing both sides, manipulating the board, Luciano began meeting secretly with Maranzano's allies while still pretending loyalty to Masuria. He presented himself not as a traitor but as a visionary. He promised an end to conflict, a new structure, a unified mafia built for America. Maranzano believed him. Masuria trusted him. Both were wrong. Luciano's real loyalty was to the future, not to either man. He fed each side selective information to prolong their suspicion of each other, weakening both, increasing his influence, and ensuring no single faction grew strong enough to oppose him when the time came. This was psychological warfare at its most precise. The coup against Masuria. The first king falls by 1931, Masuria's empire was crumbling. He had lost soldiers, influence, and strategic control. Luciano offered him one last meeting at a Coney Island restaurant, a gesture of loyalty that Masuria misinterpreted as reconciliation. While Masuria played cards, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, hitmen, men from both sides of the conflict, stormed in and killed Masuria, leaving the cards soaked in blood. Luciano had removed the first king. But the war was not over. Maranzano's brief reign. The second king rises with Masuria dead. Maranzano declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the mafia into the 5 families, a concept that appealed to Luciano's desire for structure, at first. But soon Maranzano revealed his true intent. He wanted total control, absolute obedience, and the elimination of anyone who could challenge him, including Luciano. Maranzano placed him under surveillance, ordered hits on his closest allies, and began restructuring the organization to tighten his grip. Luciano had traded one tyrant for another. The second coup, revolution in motion. Luciano's decision was swift. Maranzano had to go. But unlike Masuria, Maranzano was surrounded by loyal Sicilian bodyguards who would never allow an Italian-American like Luciano into striking distance. So Luciano innovated. He hired Jewish hitmen, including men connected to Lansky and Siegel, killers whom Maranzano's guards would not recognize. On September 10, 1931, posing as federal agents, they entered Maranzano's office and stabbed and shot him to death. The second king had fallen. The war was over. Rebuilding from ashes. The birth of a new mafia. The Castellammarese War ended in blood, but it birthed a revolution. With both tyrants gone, Luciano stepped forward, not as a dictator but as an architect. He abolished the position of Capo di tutti capi and replaced it with the Commission, a national governing body where power was shared, disputes were negotiated, and the mafia operated like a corporation rather than a monarchy. For the first time, the mafia had structure, predictability, collaboration, long-term strategy. Luciano didn't just survive the war. He used it to destroy the old world and build the new. The Castellammarese War wasn't simply a conflict. It was America's first mafia revolution. And Luciano was its quiet, lethal visionary architect. The man who ended a blood-soaked past and designed a future that would outlive him by decades. When the dust of the Castellammarese War finally settled in 1931, New York's mafia stood on the edge of collapse. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many bosses had died. Too many loyalties had been shattered. The old world, the world of Sicilian kings and rigid hierarchies, had died with Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. In that moment of vacuum and vulnerability, one truth became clear. If the mafia continued following the old rules, it would destroy itself long before law enforcement ever could. Lucky Luciano, still young but already a seasoned strategist, stepped into that empty space not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the vision of an architect. He understood the fundamental flaw of everything that had come before. Absolute power creates absolute instability. The mafia didn't need another boss of bosses. It needed a government. So Luciano built one. The coup after the coups, the quietest revolution killing Masuria and Maranzano had been violent acts, but what followed was Luciano's true revolution. A restructuring of power that required no bullets, no threats, and no dramatic declarations. He abolished the ancient and self-defeating title of Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses, a position that created jealousy, paranoia, and endless coups. Instead he proposed something radical, a council, a governing body. A commission that would oversee organized crime like a corporate board running a multinational company. Every major boss would have a voice. No one man would rule the entire underworld. Power would be distributed, regulated, and stabilized. It was in essence a silent coup, a takeover not through dominance but through redesign. The structure, a criminal congress. The commission was composed of the heads of the 5 New York families. The Luciano family, the Mangano family, the Bonanno family, the Prophesai family, the Gagliano family. Additionally, Luciano brought Chicago's Outfit, Detroit's Purple Gang, and other regional powers into the fold. For the first time, the American Mafia existed not as fractured clans but as a national syndicate. This was more than leadership. This was legislation. The Commission's responsibilities included approving major hits, dividing territories, resolving disputes, setting financial expectations, coordinating national rackets, preventing destructive internal wars. Nothing this comprehensive had ever existed in the American underworld. Luciano had created a parliament for crime. Psychology of power? Why the council worked? Luciano understood psychology better than any don before him. He knew men, their egos, fears, ambitions, and insecurities. He used this understanding to design a system that protected everyone. No one man had too much power, therefore no one man was worth killing. Everyone had a seat at the table, therefore everyone had a reason to preserve the system. Profit depended on cooperation, therefore conflict became bad business. Luciano's commission wasn't just structural, it was psychological. He had turned every boss from a potential usurper into a stakeholder. This was his masterpiece. Unifying the families, the American vision under the old Sicilian model, families operated like feudal kingdoms, each defending their lineage and soil. But Prohibition had changed America. Crime was no longer local, it was regional, even national. Luciano emphasized that survival required thinking like Americans, not Sicilians. He proposed joint ventures, bootlegging operations shared between families, gambling empires run cooperatively, drug trafficking routes protected by multiple cities, union infiltration managed across states. The commission formalized these partnerships, creating a network of interdependence stronger than any blood oath. Luciano didn't want an Italian mafia. He wanted an American mafia, modern, profitable, and organized. Rules to replace ritual, a new constitution of crime where the old mafia had vague customs and arbitrary punishments. The commission established clear, universally respected rules. 1. No murder without commission approval. This prevented impulsive killings that sparked wars. 2. Disputes must be mediated, not fought. Bosses were encouraged to settle matters through reason, not bullets. 3. Territory lines must be respected. No more turf theft or surprise encroachments. 4. Shared rackets mean shared responsibility. Families were expected to support each other's business interests. 5. Leadership changes required transparency. This prevented coups and succession battles. In short, Luciano replaced superstition with procedure. Emotion with logic. Chaos with design. Economic revolution. Criminal capitalism. The commission allowed the mafia to operate like a multinational corporation. With clear rules and shared objectives, the underworld could now expand into sectors previously considered too risky or unstable. Nationwide bootlegging, narcotics distribution through international ports, gambling hubs from New York to Cuba, union-based extortion in construction, trucking, and shipping protection rackets stabilized through cooperation by eliminating internal wars. Luciano created economic conditions for the mafia to multiply profits exponentially. The commission didn't just end conflict, it industrialized crime. A system that outsmarted America. The greatest brilliance of the Commission was its invisibility. Law enforcement had always focused on arresting individual bosses. But a council? A distributed leadership model with no single head? This confused authorities for decades. There was no throne to seize. No kingpin to topple. Luciano had removed the mafia's biggest vulnerability: centralized leadership. He built a system where removing one man meant little. A system where structure mattered more than personality. A system resilient to arrests, assassinations, and betrayals. This is why the Commission survived long after Luciano was gone. Legacy: the birth of true organized crime. The creation of the Commission was more than a mafia reform. It was the moment when American crime matured into an organized, structured, self-governing empire. Luciano had done what no gangster, Sicilian or American, had ever dreamed. He ended the age of mafia monarchies. He created a democratic model of criminal governance. He built a multifamily syndicate that controlled an entire nation. He turned crime into a regulated industry. His silent coup became the foundation of everything that followed. This was not the rise of a single dawn. This was the birth of organized crime. And at the center of it stood Lucky Luciano, not as the boss of bosses, but as the architect who made bosses unnecessary. For nearly a decade, Lucky Luciano's empire had thrived in the shadows. Quiet where others shouted, coordinated where others stumbled, structured where others improvised. He had built a machine, smooth, efficient, invisible. And for a long time, that invisibility was his greatest weapon. But every empire eventually grows too large to hide. Every shadow, no matter how deep, eventually meets the light. By the mid-1930s, the mafia was no longer a rumor whispered in the backrooms of speakeasies. It was a force, an institution, a system that touched unions, industries, nightclubs, politicians, and ports. The scale that had once impressed Luciano now threatened him. The empire was becoming visible, and visibility is death in the world he built. A changing America. The age of reform begins. America was changing. Prohibition had ended, drying up one of the mafia's biggest revenue streams and forcing criminal networks to diversify. More importantly, public tolerance for corruption was fading. Politicians who once relied on mob money now feared exposure. Newspapers, hungry for scandal, smelled blood in every alley. And at the center of these swirling forces stood a young prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey, relentless, ambitious, and uninterested in the old dance between crime and politics. Dewey didn't just want arrests. He wanted a symbol. And Luciano, with his mythic quiet authority and invisible influence, was the perfect target. Journalists follow the money, and see a phantom behind it. What began as isolated news reports soon became coordinated investigations. Journalists started tracing unusual patterns. Sudden spikes in gambling rackets, disappearances of minor gangsters, union bosses living far beyond their salaries, judges whose rulings aligned suspiciously with mob interests. They couldn't name the man behind it all, but they could describe the shape of his shadow. They wrote about a hidden mastermind, the silent ruler of New York crime, the spider at the center of the web. And for the first time, Luciano's name began appearing in print, not as a suspect but as a presence. The very invisibility that made him powerful now made him mythical. And myth invited scrutiny. Luciano felt a chill he hadn't felt since his youth, a tension. Internal tensions. Rivals smelled the shift inside the mafia, cracks widened as quickly as they formed outside. Power attracts envy, and Luciano had accumulated both in abundance. Some old-line Sicilians quietly disapproved of his multi-ethnic alliances. Some younger bosses believed they deserved greater autonomy under the Commission. Some rivals, especially Vito Genovese, saw in the growing scrutiny a chance to weaken Luciano from within. Genovese had always admired him, always served him, but never stopped wanting what Luciano had. Now, with law enforcement tightening its grip, Genovese began planting seeds of doubt. Maybe the Commission needs stronger leadership. Maybe Luciano's alliances bring too much heat. Maybe the old ways were safer after all. These whispers spread through the underworld's corridors like poison. Luciano knew the signs. He had once weaponized whispers himself. The empire grows too big, and too loud. The problem wasn't Luciano's intelligence. The problem was scale. The Commission had transformed the mafia into a national syndicate with operations in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Tampa, and beyond. Money flowed upward in torrents. Influence spread into politics, labor unions, and entertainment. But every extension of power created new exposure points. More middlemen, more informants, more corrupt officials, more fleeing associates flipping to save themselves. The brilliance of his system, delegation, was now its vulnerability. Luciano could no longer vouch for every man carrying his message, collecting his money, or using his name as leverage. He could control the structure. He could control the strategy. But he could not control interpretation. And in the dark, interpretation becomes myth. Dewey advances. The hunt becomes public. Dewey saw the cracks forming and struck with precision. He launched investigations into prostitution rings, gambling operations and union activities, not because he believed they were Luciano's core business, but because they were visible threads. Pull on a thread long enough, Dewey reasoned, and the whole web eventually reveals itself. He subpoenaed nightclub owners, dancers, taxi drivers, hotel clerks, union treasurers, anyone whose life overlapped with the underworld's orbit. Many witnesses lied, some broke, a few confessed, and all of them painted the same portrait. A man they had never met but everyone feared, everyone respected, everyone believed ran the city. Luciano became the villain of a story he never intended to star in. Paranoia takes root. The architect feels the walls closing. Luciano had always handled pressure with unshakable composure. But something changed during these months. The very networks he built, vast, elegant, interdependent, now made him vulnerable. Every ally became a potential liability. Every conversation felt like surveillance. Every movement risked detention. And worst of all, Luciano sensed that not all his enemies were outside the family. Genovese grew bolder. Old guard traditionalists quietly questioned Luciano's leadership. Rumors circulated that the commission was getting nervous. Luciano's power had once flowed like electricity through hidden wires. Now the wires hummed loudly enough for everyone to hear: law enforcement, rivals, politicians, the press. Visibility is danger. Visibility is death. The first signs of collapse. A silent unraveling. Dewey's raids intensified. Newspapers screamed for reform. Governors demanded action. The public, hungry for accountability, fixated on Lucky Luciano as a symbol of everything corrupt in American society. The legend he never crafted, the invisible king, the mastermind of vice, now turned against him with full force. His associates grew nervous. His allies distanced themselves. His rivals sharpened their knives. Luciano realized that his empire, built carefully over years, was slowly unraveling, not from a bullet, not from betrayal, but from something far more dangerous: exposure. The criminal world he had unified was no longer a quiet machine. It was a spectacle, and he was at the center of it. For the first time in his adult life, Lucky Luciano felt something unfamiliar: not fear, not weakness, but inevitability. The storm had begun. And even the architect of the American Mafia could not stop the wind that now howled through the cracks of his empire. The courtroom lights were blinding. Cameras clicked like mechanical insects. Reporters leaned so far forward they nearly toppled over the rail. In 1936, when Thomas East Dewey strode into court to prosecute Charles Lucky Luciano, the young district attorney wasn't just opening a case, he was launching a crusade. America was desperate for heroes. Dewey needed a villain. Luciano became the perfect one. Not because the public knew him, but because they didn't. His power was whispered, rumored, imagined, and in those shadows, Dewey saw the opportunity to turn him into the face of organized vice. This wasn't merely a trial. It was theater. And Luciano, who built a life on invisibility, was forced onto the brightest stage of all. Dewey takes the stage. The courtroom is a battlefield. Dewey was relentless, polished, and possessed the confidence of a man destined for higher office. Each morning he entered the courtroom with a stack of notes so precise they felt pre-orchestrated. His opening statement painted Luciano not as a man, but as a hidden system, the unseen general behind brothels, gambling rings, and extortion networks. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "this city has been ruled by fear. And today we expose the man at the top." Luciano barely flinched. Outwardly calm, inwardly calculating, he knew this fight was unlike any street war he had survived. This enemy didn't shoot in alleys, he attacked in newspapers, in testimony, in the minds of the jury. Witnesses from the underworld, testimonies shaped by fear and survival. The prosecution's witnesses were mostly prostitutes, madams, and pimps, the lowest-level survivors of a system Dewey insisted Luciano controlled. Many testimonies were shaky. Some women trembled as they spoke, terrified of both the mafia and the state. Others were eager to barter freedom for cooperation. They told stories of protection fees delivered to unknown men, brothels that answered to higher authority, whispered warnings that Lucky won't like this, fear of punishment for disobedience. Most had never seen Luciano. But Dewey didn't need them to. He needed them to create the illusion of scale. By stitching together scattered accounts, he built a towering silhouette named Lucky Luciano. The details didn't need to be perfect. The story needed to be. Betrayal from within. When loyalty begins to crumble, Luciano's empire had thrived on loyalty, but loyalty built on fear erodes under pressure. As Dewey's investigation deepened, several minor associates began cooperating, quietly, strategically. Some wanted leniency. Some wanted revenge. A few simply wanted to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Even if their information was vague or incomplete, each betrayal fed Dewey's narrative. Luciano was the invisible force everyone obeyed, even those who claimed they barely knew him. The irony was brutal. Luciano's greatest strength, his distance from direct involvement, became Dewey's greatest weapon. The media frenzy, a villain for a hungry press every day, newspapers delivered new headlines. Lucky, king of vice, city enslaved by secret mafia master, Dewey strikes back against corruption. Journalists sketched Luciano's face with sharp, shadowy lines. Editorials portrayed him as a criminal genius who manipulated New York like a chessboard. Americans devoured the story. Even people who had never heard of him now felt certain he was the mastermind of all vice. The myth became more influential than evidence. Luciano's image was now public property, twisted, magnified, weaponized. He had spent his entire career avoiding attention. Now attention was his executioner. Inside the defendant's mind, a crumbling calm, Luciano remained composed during the long sessions. His tailored suits, steady posture, and unreadable face seemed to challenge Dewey. Prove it. But beneath that calm, cracks formed. He wasn't used to being powerless. He wasn't used to narratives he couldn't control. He wasn't used to seeing people he barely knew describing him as a mythic monster. The commission kept their distance. Associates stayed silent. The empire he built to protect him felt suddenly distant, fragile, unreliable. For the first time, Luciano sensed the machinery he designed turning without him, or worse, turning against him. Dewey's final blow, a closing argument like a verdict near the end of the trial. Dewey delivered a closing argument that shook the room. He didn't rely on legal technicalities. He spoke with the fire of a preacher and the precision of a surgeon. He described a city poisoned by vice, a chain of command enforced by fear, women treated as commodities, and Luciano as the brain behind it all. He is the silent dictator of organized vice, Dewey told the jury. A man too clever to be caught with his hands dirty. It didn't matter that no document, no photograph, no confession tied Luciano directly to the crimes. Dewey's story felt true. And truth in the courtroom is often a matter of feeling. The verdict, a king without a kingdom. On June 6, 1936, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty. 62 counts. Sentence, 30 to 50 years. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reporters sprinted for telephones. Dewey smiled, victory not just legal but political. Luciano did not react. He adjusted his tie. He nodded once. Inside, something cold settled. This wasn't the result of a mistake or betrayal or bad luck. This was the price of inevitability. The empire he built had become too visible, too powerful, too mythic to escape the grasp of a man like Dewey. This trial wasn't the fall of Lucky Luciano. It was the beginning of his transformation, from architect of the underworld to prisoner of his own legend. When the gates of Clinton prison clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano, many believed the story had ended. The empire was broken, the king caged, the myth finally defeated. But prisons, Luciano quickly learned, did not erase power, they merely changed the geography of it. Inside cold stone walls, surrounded by murderers and thieves, he remained what he had always been, a strategist. His tools were fewer. His movements restricted. But influence, true influence, is not measured in miles or muscle. It is measured in networks. And Luciano's network still pulsed far beyond the bars. The prison environment, a new ecosystem to master Clinton prison, was a world with its own currency, alliances, and silent codes. Most inmates survived by force or fear. Luciano survived by understanding. Within weeks, he knew which guards could be swayed, which inmates held quiet power, which routines created vulnerabilities, which factions needed a mediator more than a leader. He was no inmate. He was an analyst. He didn't dominate the prison, he infiltrated it. He offered advice, solved disputes, arranged trades of favors, and ensured that violence never touched him unless he allowed it. Influence, even here, was about stability. And Luciano provided it. Running an empire through intermediaries, though physically trapped, Luciano still had something no other prisoner had: a living empire outside the walls. He communicated through corrupt guards who smuggled letters, lawyers who carried coded messages, visitors who spoke in half-phrases, underbosses who understood orders without words. He never issued direct commands. That was too risky. Instead, he relied on what he had built years earlier, a decentralized system that functioned through loyalty and logic rather than micromanagement. Operations continued. Gambling rings stayed profitable, union influence remained intact, international narcotics routes stabilized. The commission still respected his voice. Luciano had designed a structure too strong to collapse with his imprisonment. If anything, prison proved how complete his design truly was. He wasn't ruling through fear anymore. He was ruling through architecture. Psychological survival. The mind that wouldn't break. Prison does one of two things. It crushes a man or it reveals him. Luciano didn't break. He adapted. He woke early, exercised, read tirelessly, and treated each day like a study of human nature. He watched guards for weaknesses. He watched inmates for patterns. He watched visitors for subtle shifts in tone. Isolation didn't weaken him. It sharpened him. He allowed himself no fantasies of escape, no delusions of freedom. Instead, he focused on what he could control, the future. His mind became the one place Dewey couldn't reach. But even Luciano felt something dangerous creeping in. The first hints of irrelevance. The younger generation of mobsters was rising faster than he could track from behind bars. Markets shifted. Alliances evolved. New rackets appeared, old ones faded. He could feel time pushing him toward the shadow he once commanded. And then, unexpectedly, the world changed. World War II, a global crisis opens his cell door, metaphorically. In 1942 the world was burning. German submarines attacked U.S. ships along the East Coast. Sabotage fears spread through New York's docks. Rumors swirled of Axis spies infiltrating unions and waterfront labor. The U.S. government needed order in places where law meant nothing. They needed control of the docks, the heart of military supply lines. They needed cooperation from the men who ruled those docks. And those men answered to Lucky Luciano. Meyer Lansky served as the bridge. Through him, intelligence operatives approached Luciano with a proposal. Help secure the New York waterfront. Help protect military cargo. Help prevent sabotage. It was surreal, the U.S. government turning to an imprisoned criminal for aid in a global war. But Luciano understood opportunity when he saw it. Operation Underworld, the alliance no one expected. Luciano agreed carefully, strategically. This was not charity. It was leverage. From his prison cell, he arranged communication channels with union leaders, controlled violence to deter saboteurs, smoother wartime operations across Italian neighborhoods, cooperation between dockworkers and naval intelligence reports claimed strikes were reduced, theft plummeted, and suspicious activity was punished swiftly. The U.S. Navy got stability. Luciano got relevance, and a powerful bargaining chip. His value had outlasted his freedom. Even behind bars, he remained a figure the government could neither control nor ignore. The message to the underworld, the architect still lives. News of Luciano's involvement in the war effort reached criminal circles. It reminded everyone, from young captains to aging bosses, that Luciano was not gone. You cannot erase the architect of the system you still use. His name regained weight. His influence rekindled. His voice once again mattered in decisions made by the commission. Even enemies like Genovese treaded more carefully, unsure of how much power Luciano still possessed. Luciano had achieved something improbable. He remained influential in a world he could no longer physically enter. Power redefined, a threat even in captivity. The war showed America something unsettling. A man in a prison cell could still affect national security. A gangster stripped of freedom could still move invisible wires. A criminal outcast could still be useful, and dangerous, to the state itself. For Luciano, prison had become paradoxical. It contained him. But it did not constrain him. His empire survived. His relevance revived. And his legend expanded. He wasn't just Lucky Luciano anymore. He was the architect of influence, the man who proved that true power is not bound by walls, distance, or time. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in 1946, exiled permanently from the United States, the air of Naples hit him like a ghost from a past he no longer recognized. The man who once commanded an empire across oceans now stood on worn Italian soil with nothing but a suitcase and a reputation that held no authority here. America had been his battlefield. Italy was his exile. Luciano had always controlled his fate, through strategy, alliances, calculation. But deportation was different. This time he was being erased. A stranger returning home. Naples greeted him not with reverence, but with suspicion. Police followed him. Officials monitored his meetings. Neighbors whispered. To them, he wasn't a king returning to his birthplace. He was an American-made criminal whose presence promised trouble. Luciano realized quickly that exile was not just relocation, it was isolation. He had no crew, no soldiers, no familiar streets. The rhythms of Sicilian and Neapolitan life felt foreign. Even the language carried accents and cadences that had changed since his childhood. He was home. But he didn't belong. A mind that still wanted to command despite exile, Luciano refused to fade quietly. His instincts, the strategic ones that had built the American mafia, would not allow rest. He reached out to old connections, then to new ones. He met with smugglers, local dons, businessmen with questionable interests. He tried to rebuild influence across 3 regions. Italy, where the mafia had its own traditions and internal conflicts. America, where the commission still respected him, but no longer depended on him. Cuba, where he saw promise in gambling, tourism, and narcotics pipelines. He believed he could still be relevant, perhaps not as ruler but as advisor, architect, strategist. But the world had changed more than he expected. The Cuba interlude, a brief spark of power in the late 1940s, Luciano made his boldest attempt at reinvention. With Batista's corrupt government controlling Cuba, Havana became a playground for mobsters seeking legal cover for illegal fortunes. Luciano, using intermediaries, found himself at the center of discussions about gambling, narcotics distribution, and political protection. For a moment, just a moment, he felt the old power return. He attended secret meetings. He gave quiet instructions. He felt the underworld's gears turning again in response to his presence. Young mobsters looked at him with awe. Old ones treated him with reverence. It felt like a rebirth. But the rebirth was short-lived. The American government shuts the door again when U.S. intelligence discovered Luciano's presence in Havana. Alarms exploded in Washington. The mere thought of a deported mafia architect rebuilding influence so close to U.S. shores was unacceptable. The pressure on Cuba became unbearable. Batista expelled him. Luciano was forced back to Italy, again unwanted, again powerless. This return was different. It wasn't exile. It was defeat. The message was clear. He would never command the American underworld again. A crumbling influence. Watching the empire move on back in Italy, Luciano attempted to keep a hand in narcotics operations, but his control was fragmented and unreliable. International heroin routes shifted toward Marseille and the Middle East. New players emerged, ruthless, innovative, unbound by the rules he had established. Meanwhile, the commission in America evolved without him. New bosses rose. New alliances formed. New wars erupted, and ended, without his involvement. They still respected him. But respect is not relevance. Luciano watched from afar as younger men played the game he once dominated. They used pieces he invented, moved on boards he had drawn, benefited from rules he created, but none of them needed him. The empire still lived. But the king was gone. This was the cruelty of legacy, to build something so strong that it no longer needs the builder. The psychological unraveling, a mind that won't let go, isolation chipped at him. Irrelevance hollowed him. Nostalgia became a torment. He walked the streets of Naples like a ghost slipping between memories. Cafes, alleys, and ports reminded him of nothing, because nothing here belonged to the man he had become. He reread old letters from Lansky. He replayed conversations with Siegel. He imagined commission meetings unfolding without him. He missed the tension of negotiation, the thrill of crisis, the subtle art of persuasion. He missed being a necessary man. In the privacy of his apartment, he sometimes laid out cigarette boxes like pieces on a board, simulating the moves of bosses half a world away. Not because he believed he was still part of the game, but because he couldn't stop needing the game. A legend in slow decline, Luciano aged quickly in exile. The lines on his face deepened. His eyes lost their spark but never their watchfulness. He still met with admirers, still spoke with young gangsters who came seeking wisdom. But these moments were thin echoes of the past. He was no longer architect or strategist or leader. He had become a monument, admired but immobile. And he felt the tragedy of it every day. He had ended wars, rewritten codes, and designed the greatest criminal structure in American history, only to live out his final years as a spectator, cut off from the very world he built. A king without a kingdom. In early 1962, Luciano died of a heart attack at the Naples airport after meeting with a filmmaker interested in his life story. It was a fittingly ironic end. A man once feared for his invisibility dying while preparing to step into the light. He died as many great architects do, not defeated, not forgotten, but outlived by his own creation. Lucky Luciano built a kingdom that reshaped American crime forever. But in the end, he walked its borders alone, a king without a kingdom, a legend watching his shadow stretch far beyond his reach. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, the world did not simply lose a criminal figure, it lost the architect of a new kind of power. His life had been a collision of brutality and brilliance, instinct and strategy, violence and vision. And while his physical presence ended in exile, the systems he created continued to breathe, move and evolve long after he was gone. Luciano did not merely reshape the mafia. He reshaped America, and, eventually, the world. His influence can be traced in political corruption, business organization, global drug routes, and the very psychology of modern organized crime. To understand Luciano is to understand the template for underground empires that followed. A criminal corporation, Luciano's structural revolution before Luciano, crime in America resembled feudal warfare. Small gangs, tribal loyalties, emotional decisions and unpredictable violence. Luciano's genius was recognizing that Prohibition-era America required something far more sophisticated. He introduced a corporate mindset into the criminal world. Clear hierarchies, delegated authority, specialized departments, diversification of revenue, profit-driven decision-making, negotiated conflict resolution. This structure allowed the mafia to operate like a multinational corporation, with New York as its headquarters and regional families functioning as branch offices. Modern crime syndicates, from Mexican cartels to Eastern European mafias, still mirror the blueprint he created. Luciano made organized crime scalable. The Commission, America's underworld Congress. Perhaps Luciano's greatest innovation was the Commission, a governing council that abolished the self-destructive boss of bosses system. By decentralizing power, Luciano eliminated the internal coups and civil wars that had nearly destroyed the mafia during the Castellamarese conflict. The Commission ensured regulated violence, shared decision-making, controlled territory disputes, collaborative business ventures. This model has echoed across continents. Sicilian mafia cupola councils, Russian Bratva networks, Yakuza federations and South American cartel boards all operate on principles Luciano pioneered. His idea was simple, powerful, and revolutionary. If power is shared, the system becomes immortal. The psychology of control, influence over intimidation. Luciano's brilliance wasn't just structural, it was psychological. He understood people with almost surgical precision. Their fears, their ambitions, their weaknesses, their desires. He ruled not by shouting, but by listening. Not by threatening, but by negotiating. Not by hoarding power, but by distributing it strategically. This approach reshaped the psychology of leadership within the criminal world. Bosses after him learned that longevity came not from brutality, but from predictability and stability. Luciano showed that fear was temporary, but systems once built could last generations. His legacy is felt in every modern underworld where strategy outranks savagery. Political influence, corruption reimagined. Luciano also redefined how criminals interacted with political power. Instead of bribing low-level policemen or occasional judges, he sought influence at the institutional level. Unions, ports, labor organizations, nightclubs, shipping companies. By controlling industries that cities depended on, he forced political machines to negotiate with him rather than chase him. He didn't just corrupt politicians, he made himself indispensable to them. His model transformed criminal influence from back-alley bribery into strategic penetration of public systems, something that continues in modern politics worldwide. From New York ports to Cuban casinos to international drug corridors, Luciano demonstrated that the line between criminal and businessman could be manipulated, blurred, and eventually erased. A global criminal economy, the Luciano effect. World War II and post-war globalization opened the door for international rackets, especially narcotics trafficking. Though he never fully controlled the heroin pipeline he envisioned, Luciano's attempts laid the foundations for Mediterranean smuggling networks, French Connection heroin routes, global money laundering corridors, cooperative cartels spanning continents. His failed ambitions became blueprints for others. His partial networks became templates for global syndicates. Luciano did not create international drug trafficking. He created the architecture that allowed it to thrive. Pop culture, myth, and the duality of legacy. Every era mythologizes its villains. Luciano's name became shorthand for the intelligent gangster, the gentleman criminal, the strategic mastermind. Hollywood borrowed his silhouette. Books romanticized his calm ruthlessness. Newspapers exaggerated both his power and his menace. Yet beneath the myth was a dual reality. He was a ruthless criminal, and a brilliant strategist. He ordered murders, exploited women, and profited from suffering. He also designed structures that still define criminal enterprise. His legacy forces a difficult truth. Some of the most enduring systems in modern America, legal and illegal, were shaped by men who understood power outside the boundaries of morality. Luciano was one of those men. The echo that never fades decades after his death, his influence remains. Mafia families still operate through rules he wrote. Cartels mimic his decentralized management style. Political corruption follows footprints he left. Every major criminal enterprise runs on structures he pioneered. Even law enforcement tactics evolved in response to him. He forced America to understand organized crime not as chaos, but as an institution. Luciano's true legacy is not in the crimes he committed, but in the systems he engineered. He proved that power doesn't vanish with exile, and it doesn't die with imprisonment. Power survives through architecture. Lucky Luciano changed America forever, by building a world that outlived him, and a blueprint still studied, feared, copied, and chased to this day.